today we'll talk a little bit about science communication and what goes into a formal science report, whether that's an oral presentation or a written report, and then I'll talk through the remaining final project assignments. Okay, so before we do that, hold on, I'm gotta fix something on my screen here, hold on. Okay, so before we do that, I'm gonna take a minute for our mental health and well-being. So I just wanted to remind you that we are all going through different things. We're all stressed out on different levels. We're all dealing with things we've never dealt with before. So I just want to remind you that being stressed can actually reduce your working memory. There's research that shows this. So when we're stressed out, from an evolutionary standpoint, our body is used to taking blood from our brain and then putting it into our body, because normally if there's some sort of like stress in front of us or threat, we have to run away. So if you're finding it hard to think and do work, that's because, you know, stress is actually having a physiological effect on your body. So be easy on yourself. I find it's easiest if I set small goals each day and work in small time chunks. Last week I suggested maybe setting a timer for 25 minutes and then take a 5-minute break, and then 25 minutes, and try to, you know, work distraction free for those 25 minutes. If you can't do that, do it for 10 minutes. Or if you're feeling a little more focused, do a 45-minute chunk and then a 15-minute break. But that's what research shows is most effective for getting work done. It's not someone who can work 8 hours straight. It's someone who is able to, you know, do small things and check things off the box, check boxes off. If possible, stay connected to people in the class, including me. Ask for help when you need it now more than ever, because we're not seeing each other. A lot of the instructions might not be clear. So please reach out to me or your classmates. And just, again, I was talking with one of my colleagues who in his office on campus, they're actually interviewing students to see how things are going. And all the students they talk to are reporting having a hard time with motivation and focus. So if you're feeling that, you're not alone. That doesn't make it any easier, but know that there's nothing wrong with you if you're having problems focusing and staying motivated. We're almost there, so hopefully that's a good motivation. And just a reminder that our campus has kept some important resources open for you. The Health and Counseling Center is open. You can do online counseling if you just want to talk with someone about strategies for how to overcome stress and get your work done. The student cupboard's open if you need food. There are financial services for you. So use those resources because they're still open for you and available. If you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out to me and I can try to connect you with the right person. So anytime we're doing a scientific report, and when I'm talking about scientific report, I mean either an oral presentation, a poster at a scientific conference, or a written report, there are some key components. So I'm going to give you a minute to just look over this, this outline that's in front of you, and I'm going to ask you some questions in a second, so be ready to jump in on either the chat box or the participant window if you have those available to you. I'm just going to give you a minute to look over the structure of a typical scientific report. And this is typical structure for a written report, and then we'll talk about how that might differ if you give an oral presentation. Okay, so go ahead and take 30 seconds to type in the chat box anything you notice about the structure, anything that stands out to you, maybe something you learned or just something that you already knew but seems really helpful. So what do you notice about the structure of this report? Great, we got a question chiming in. Anyone else have questions, comments, things you observed? So one of the things that came out in the chat box is results are reported in the introduction. That's an interesting observation. And then there doesn't appear to be a conclusion in this structure here. So those are two really interesting observations. So I'll answer those questions separately. So yes, we do try to actually put a little preview of the results in the introduction. And depending on who you are, there may be different preferences about this, but I find that the most effective scientific papers, because most of us read the introduction first, as one of the things to decide if we're actually going to finish reading the paper, it's helpful to give the reader a little teaser about what they're going to find in this paper. So not just an outline, but actually a kind of take-home point about what's most important. And this isn't on this slide, but we'll talk about this as one of the tips. Usually your title is also a brief summary of the paper in itself. So if the title is a headline, which means that we can actually learn something from the title, then you are already giving away some of the major results in the title. And so it's okay to give a little teaser in the introduction. Now, different professors you talk to or different scientists might have a slightly different approach, but I find that this is actually really helpful for me as a reader, and that it's helpful to put into your papers as well as kind of an overview of what people might see. So 1 to 2 sentences of kind of a preview. And then there is no conclusion listed here separately. A lot of times we do have a separate conclusion paragraph. Usually the conclusions would start, so let me come back over. Yeah, the conclusions would start kind of here, where contributions beyond your paper and why science is better. So the conclusion might add a couple boxes here. So they've listed discussion, but that would also include the conclusions. Any other observations or questions about this structure? Okay, so what I want you to be thinking about, and maybe some of this is obvious, but it's helpful to have this really bare bones outline when you go to put all your results from your final project together into something that you can communicate to other people who are not part of that project, is thinking about where the different information goes. So one of the things that I think is helpful about this structure also is that it shows you that at the beginning, in the introduction, we start with a really big picture question or problem. So kind of like the biggest, broadest importance to everybody. And then you slowly narrow down to what this specific paper is addressing related to this bigger issue. So for example, in our final project, you're looking at climate change might be a really big problem in science that we're all trying to address. Yet climate change in Arctic regions might be really important, or climate changes from ocean records in the past might be important for helping understand climate change in the future. So that might be a narrower problem. And then the yet narrower paper gap would be this specific project looks at the Gulf of Alaska. And then I would give a brief summary of what the paper is. So we start really big and then we get small. And then as you notice in the discussion and conclusions, as we pointed out, that we go from kind of like the bare bones, here's the results, to what I found. Here's maybe some limitations or how this might compare to other parts of the globe. So if we're looking at a local climate record, you know, this is only a local climate record. It's not telling us about everything that was going on in the globe at that time. And then we get to the bigger picture again. How has what we've done helped us learn something about climate change, and what, you know, why is science better now? So you start big and you end big. And that would be true whether you're giving a written report or an oral report. And then we have another comment from the Peanut Gallery that this is a very kind of bare bones structure, not a lot of fluff. And that is very true in scientific writing. We really get to the point pretty quickly. There's not a lot of fluff. There's not a lot of beating around the bush leading up to a point. We kind of start with the headline in the title, and each paragraph will also start with a topic sentence that tells you what you're gonna look at. And I will tell you from experience that I'm currently looking at a bunch of history papers as part of our university's evaluation of writing, and their writing as seniors is completely different than how you guys write in our science classes. So it is very different. They have to write like 25-page papers for their final report, and I would not expect you to write more than 5 pages for this final report, and you're still going to get a lot of information presented. So there's just all very different approaches depending on what discipline you're in. So what I'm trying to do in this class is just get you to be aware of the conventions that we use in science, and they are different. And even within your, several years in college, you versus your colleagues in other majors write very differently. So you are already starting to distinguish yourself in your field. Okay, we talked about that. Okay, any other comments or questions about this structure before I move on? Feel free to say yes or no if you have a question in the participant box. Okay, I still see X's, so I'm hoping that means you don't have questions. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. So this is a paper that you're going to read for this week as part of your reading assignment. It's relatively short, and again, it's focused on helping us learn the conventions and having really a structure and guide as you're writing. So this isn't something that you learn and then you're automatically a good writer for the rest of your life. This is something that all scientists are constantly working on, is how can I better communicate? So having this structure and guide is helpful. Even if you feel like you're a pretty good writer, it's still helpful to know and to have this focus. So there are 10 rules. I'm not going to go through all of them today because you'll look at them in the paper for this week. And if you have questions, feel free to include those in your reading reflection or to send me an email. But again, you're going to focus on one big idea, and that's going to be communicated in the title. So the title should be a headline of, an interesting piece of information that came from your study. Now, this is something that a lot of you commented that the oral presentation, the guest seminar that I had posted on the carbonate, was a little bit hard to follow, especially the last couple sections. So you want to learn from that experience and write for naive humans. So even though you're writing this report for maybe someone else in this class or another geologist, it's still helpful to write as clearly as possible and not make any assumptions about what terms they know and don't know. So we will continue to talk about that, but that's something that we're always practicing. One thing I wanted to point out, which is an interesting way of thinking about things, is this idea of context, content, and conclusion. So the context sets up kind of like why this study is important. So that might be in the introduction, why is the study important? What is it contributing to our larger body of knowledge? The content is the meat of your study. What did we actually find? What are our results? What are our interpretations? And then the conclusions, again, gets back to that bigger picture. Why is science better now? So I want you to think about, as you're structuring, whether it's an oral presentation or written report, setting the context. Why is this important? Providing the content, only the most important information that your audience needs to know. And then the conclusions, reminding your audience, why is this important and what have I contributed by doing this project? And this can also be used at a paragraph scale. So not just for the whole report, but you could say at the beginning of a paragraph, you have the context. Why is this section important? What did I find? And then having a summary sentence at the end. So this CCC structure could be used at different scales in the paper. So I think that's an interesting, I never heard of it written out that way, but that is typically how we write, and that will help your audience follow what you're doing as you're writing or presenting. Another thing I wanted to draw attention to is allocating your time wisely. This is really important, especially given right now that we only have so much time and mental energy. You don't necessarily spend an equal amount of time on each parts of a written report or presentation. Your title is really important because it focuses on that one big idea, gives the reader a sense of what they should see. If you're writing the written report, you will have an abstract. That's, again, the summary of your entire paper. We usually do that last, though. Once we know what we found, we write the abstract. But it does take some time to actually write a complete summary. And then what I would say you're spending a lot of time on in these smaller assignments are the figures and tables right now. So as you prepare, whether you're doing a presentation or a paper, focus on the figures and tables first. What is the main content I'm going to communicate in this presentation or report, and then build in the text or the slides. from that. And so doing a lot of outlining at the beginning can be helpful. Do not just start with writing the introduction, because that's usually the hardest section to write. So I would start with your figures and tables, your results, and then talk about, and then do some outlining of what are the key sections that you need to do the written report. So I just wanted to remind you that, you know, not all sections are created equally in terms of the time you spend on it. And we don't necessarily write them or create them in the order in which they're presented in the paper or the presentation. So that's really important.